welcome to Storytime with Mr. Ryan. Today, as part of my Great People series, we're going to be learning about a very important person in American history, Sacagawea. Just who was this mysterious Native American figure, Sacagawea? Well, today we find out in Sacagawea by Lise Erdrich and with illustrations by Julie Buffalohead. Let's hop on in. In a rocky mountain valley where three rivers flowed into one, near the year 1800, a group of Shoshone Indians had set up camp. They came down out of the mountains only once a year in search of buffalo. On this day, the women were drying buffalo meat over the fire, and the men had gone hunting. A young girl, about 11 or 12 years old, was busy helping to prepare for winter. She gathered roots and berries and firewood along the riverbank. The women had to work quickly. They were in enemy territory, and the enemy tribes had rifles. Suddenly, the teepee camp exploded in noise and confusion. The enemy was attacking. The girl ran into the river trying to escape. Hidatsa warriors grabbed her and sped away on horseback. Other Shoshone were captured or killed. Their beautiful horses were stolen. The Hidatsa warriors and their captives traveled east. Mountains and forests faded in the distance behind them as they crossed the Great Plains. The young Shoshone girl was overwhelmed by the vast open space as she was taken farther and farther from all she knew. She stared in astonishment when at last, one morning, they reached the Earth Lodge villages of the Hidatsa and Mandan people. Women were paddling down a river in bowl-shaped boats on the way to their gardens. Smoke rose from large upside-down bowls crowded on the high riverbank. These bowls had doors with people coming out. So many! There were 5,000 people in the Indian villages where the Knife River entered the Missouri River. Even St. Louis, the important far-off city of white man fur traders, did not have that many people. The young Shoshone girl joined a Hidatsa household. She was given the name Sacagawea, which means bird woman. The Hidatsa women taught her how to tend their gardens, which grew in the rich soil along the river. Sacagawea marveled at the wonderful new plants: corn, squash, beans, pumpkins, sunflowers. Her Shoshone people did not grow gardens. They were wanderers who gathered their food from the wild. Sacagawea learned to sing to the corn to help it grow. She chased away hungry birds. The sunflower, friendly soul of the garden, brightened her days. She carried home the harvest in a round bull boat, a boat made from a buffalo hide with the tail left on for a handle. Sacagawea had been with the Hidatsa family almost 4 years when she was given in marriage to Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper. Sacagawea was no more than 16. Charbonneau was at least 20 years older than she was. While Sacagawea was learning the ways of her new world, President Thomas Jefferson was making plans for an expedition. It would be known as the Corps of Discovery. The people of the United States knew almost nothing about the land between the Mississippi River and the Pacific Ocean. And the Native Americans who lived there did not know that the United States had just bought a large portion of this land from France. Indeed, they did not believe that any of the earth could be bought or sold. Jefferson was hoping explorers could find a way to travel most of the way from the Mississippi to the Pacific by boat. He also wanted them to learn everything they could know about this unknown land and the people who lived there. The expedition would be led by Captain Meriwether Lewis and Captain William Clark. It would begin near St. Louis, where the Missouri River flowed into the Mississippi. On May 4th, 1804, a crew of more than 40 men set off against the Missouri River current in a keelboat and 2 large canoes called pirogues. The Corps of Discovery was underway. The expedition arrived at the Knife River villages at the end of October. They were greeted with great excitement. Sacagawea heard tales of a gigantic black dog that traveled with the explorers. She heard that a fierce and awesome white man with black skin was among the crew. This was York, the slave of Captain Clark. The explorers built a fort and called it Fort Mondon. Then they settled in to spend the winter at the Knife River villages. Lewis and Clark soon learned that they would need horses to cross the Rocky Mountains. The people of the villages told them they could get the horses from the Shoshone when the expedition crossed or reached the mountain passes. The wily Charbonneau proposed that they hire him as a guide and interpreter. He did not speak Shoshone, but Sacagawea did. He told her they would be joining the Corps of Discovery in the spring. This was exciting news, but Sacagawea's mind was on other matters. She was soon to become a mother. In February, the time came for Sacagawea to have her baby. It was a long, difficult birth. Captain Lewis wanted to help her. He gave a crew member 2 rattlesnake rattles to crush and mix with water. Just a few minutes after drinking the mixture, Sacagawea gave birth to a baby boy. He was named Jean-Baptiste Charbonneau, but Captain Clark called him Pompey. Before long, the boy was known to everyone as Pomp. On April 7th, 1805, the Corps of Discovery started west, struggling upstream on the mighty, muddy Missouri in 2 pirogues and 6 smaller canoes. Pomp was not yet 2 months old. As Sacagawea walked along the riverbank, she carried Pomp on her back in a cradle board or wrapped up snug in her shawl. Every member of the Corps of Discovery was hired for a special skill. Hunter, blacksmith, woodsman, sailor. As an interpreter, Charbonneau was paid much more than the other crew members, but his skills as a sailor, guide, and outdoorsman were very poor. The only thing he did well was cook buffalo sausage. Sacagawea did what she could to help the expedition, even though she was paid nothing. As she walked along the shore with Captain Clark, Sacagawea looked for plants to keep the crew healthy. She gathered berries or dug for wild artichoke roots with her digging stick. Her Shoshone childhood had prepared her well for this journey. The Corps had been traveling less than 2 months when near disaster struck. Charbonneau was steering a boat through choppy waters when a sudden high wind tipped it sideways. He lost his wits and dropped the rudder while the boat filled with water. The expedition's valuables were spilling overboard. Charbonneau was ordered to right the boat or be shot. Sacagawea stayed calm and rescued the captain's important things. Journals, gunpowder, medicines, scientific instruments, every bundle she could reach. Without these supplies, the expedition could not have continued. A few days later, they came to a beautiful river. The graceful captains named it after Sacagawea. By June, the Corps was entering mountain country. Soon they could hear the distant roaring sound of the great falls of the Missouri. Captain Lewis thought the waterfall was the grandest sight he had ever seen, but there was no way to get past it by boat. It would take the Corps nearly a month to get around the Great Falls and the 4 waterfalls they found just beyond it. The crew built creaky, clumsy wagons to carry their boats and supplies. Battered by hail, rain, and wind, the men dragged the wagons over sharp rocks and prickly pear cactus that punctured their moccasins. One day, a freak cloudburst caused a flash flood. Rocks, mud, and water came crashing down the canyon. Sacagawea held on to her son as tight as she could, while Clark pushed and pulled them both to safety. Pomp's cradleboard, clothes, and bedding were swept away by the rushing water, but all 3 were unharmed. By the middle of July, the Corps once again was paddling up the Missouri. They reached a valley where 3 rivers came together, a place Sacagawea knew well. If she was upset to see it again, she did not show it. The captains learned how Sacagawea had been captured and her people killed. Sacagawea recognized a landmark that her people called the Beaverhead Mountain. She knew they must be nearing the summer camp of the Shoshone. Nearly 2 weeks later, Sacagawea walked along the river, scanning the familiar territory. She spotted some men on horseback far ahead of them. Suddenly, Captain Clark saw Sacagawea dance up and down with happiness, sucking her fingers. He knew this sign meant that these were her people, the Shoshone. An excited crowd greeted the explorers at the Shoshone camp. Although years had passed since Sacagawea had been captured, a Shoshone woman recognized her. She rushed up to Sacagawea and threw her arms around her. Lewis and Clark had discovered that their need for Shoshone horses was even greater than they thought. There was far more mountain country between the Missouri River and a water route to the Pacific than they expected. A ground council was called to discuss the matter. Sacagawea was to be one of the translators. Interpreting for the men at the chief's council was a serious responsibility. Sacagawea wanted to do her best, but when she looked at the face of the Shoshone chief, she burst into tears. He was her brother, Kamehameha. Sacagawea jumped up, threw her blanket over her brother, and wept. Kamehameha was moved too, but the council had to continue. Though tears kept flooding back, Sacagawea kept to her duty until the council ended. Sacagawea spent the last days of August with her people. The time passed too quickly. Before long, the expedition had to mount Shoshone Indian horses and continue across the mountains, leaving their boats behind. The next part of their journey almost killed them. The mountain paths were narrow and dangerous, especially once it started to snow. Their feet froze, they didn't have enough to eat, and the mountain seemed without end. Finally, the expedition emerged on the Pacific side of the Rockies. There, Nez Perce Indians helped them make new boats and agreed to keep the horses in case they returned that way in the spring. With great relief, the crew dropped their boats into the Clearwater River and let the current carry the expedition toward the ocean. At the beginning of November, the explorers noticed a sound that could only be the crashing of waves. They had finally reached the Pacific Ocean. The crew voted on where to make winter camp. Sacagawea was allowed to vote too. She wanted to stay where she could find plenty of wapato roots for winter food. They set up camp not far from the ocean in case a ship came to take them back home. But by now, people back east were sure the whole Corps was long dead. No ship came for them. A cold rain soaked the crew as they cut logs and built Fort Clatsop. The hunters went to find game while Sacagawea dug for wapato roots in the soggy ground. Christmas Day was rainy and dreary, but the Corps was determined to celebrate. The men fired a salute with their guns and sang. Sacagawea gave Captain Clark a fine gift of 24 white weasel tails. In early January, Clark heard from some Indians that a whale had washed up on shore. He decided to go to the ocean to get blubber for the crew to eat. They were tired of their diet of lean, spoiled meat and fish. Sacagawea gathered up her courage and insisted that she be allowed to accompany Clark. She hadn't traveled so far to leave without ever seeing the ocean, and she wanted to see that monstrous creature. The captains agreed to let her go. At last, Sacagawea saw the Pacific Ocean. She stood and stared at the great waters stretching endlessly in front of her. On the beach was the greatest skeleton of the whale. It was an amazing sight, nearly as long as 20 men lying end to end. The whale had been picked clean, but Clark was able to buy some blubber from the Indians to feed his men. The crew stayed busy all winter, hunting, sewing moccasins, and making repairs on their equipment. Clark made maps while Lewis worked on his report to President Jefferson. Sacagawea watched over Pomp as he began to walk. Captain Clark called him my little dancing boy. He had become very attached to Sacagawea and her son. When the time came, it would be hard for them to part. Spring arrived, and it was time to go back the way they had come. In late March, the Corps of Discovery headed up the Columbia River to retrieve their horses from the Nez Perce. At a place called Traveler's Rest, the expedition divided into two groups. Sacagawea would help guide Clark's group south to the Yellowstone River. Lewis's group would head northeast to explore the Marias River. At the end of July, Clark's group came across an enormous rock tower on the banks of the Yellowstone. Clark named it Pompey's Tower in honor of his beloved little friend. In the side of the rock, he carved W. Clark, July 25, 1806. The two groups met up on August 12th. 2 days later, Sacagawea gazed once again upon the round earth lodges of the Knife River villages. She had been gone a year and 4 months. Lewis and Clark prepared to return to St. Louis. Before they left, Captain Clark came to talk to Sacagawea and Charbonneau. He offered to take Bump back to St. Louis with him. He would see that the boy had a good education and would raise him as his own son. Sacagawea knew that Captain Clark would take good care of her child, but he was not even 2 years old. She couldn't let him go yet. Sacagawea and Charbonneau promised they would bring Pomp to visit Clark in a year or so. On August 17, 1806, Sacagawea watched as the Corps of Discovery set off again down the Missouri River. Her journey of exploration was over, but the Corps of Discovery still had hundreds of miles to go. Thank you all very much for sticking around and for reading this story. I know it was a long one, but Sacagawea has a wonderful and extensive legacy. I hope you enjoyed reading the story of courage and discovery and how our little country came to be. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. Please feel free to check out my other stories on this channel, or if you're looking for fun activities you can do from home, go ahead and check out veronalibrary.org/children. Until next time, I'll be seeing you. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.